Hi, I'm Mel, an artist and educator, and welcome to my channel. This is a full-length drawing tutorial where you can watch me complete a drawing from start to finish with nothing cut out or sped up. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, and I'd love to chat with you in the comments if you have any questions. I'm going to be using the grid technique to work from this photograph of a pepper, and I want to make the drawing bigger than the reference. So first I'm going to need to measure the height and width of the reference and then draw an initial grid onto my reference photo. I'm going to use inches as my unit of measurement. You can really use any measurement you like, and it can depend on how complex the image is. If you have loads of tiny details in your reference, then you may want to use ½ inch or even smaller. So I'm just using a ruler to roughly measure the height and width of the reference, allowing a little extra. So in this case, my pepper is around 9 inches high by about 6 inches wide. I'll start by drawing a 9-inch line for one side of my grid, making it fairly parallel to the edge of the paper, and I'm making marks at 1-inch intervals. These are going to form the structure of my grid. Now, as I'm going to draw the top horizontal line, I'm going to use a set square to make sure that the angle between these two lines is 90 degrees. Now, this is one of the most common mistakes with drawing out a grid. If your grid starts out wonky, it can make your drawing look a bit wonky later, and by that time, it's quite hard to fix. So now I have the angle right, I'll now draw that 6-inch line with marks at the 1-inch intervals. If you don't have a set square, you can just use a piece of pre-cut paper, as in paper which you haven't cut yourself. If it comes out of a pack or a sketchbook, we can be reasonably confident that it has a nice straight 90-degree corner to it, which works just as well as using a set square. I'll now repeat this process to draw in the other sides of the grid. Now that I have all 4 sides of my grid drawn in, I can just use those inch markers that I've made to fill in those missing grid lines. Just a note about the shape of your grid squares. It's actually pretty important that your grid squares are actually square. So 1 inch by 1 inch in my case here. If they are rectangular, it introduces a little bit more complexity and more room for error when you start multiplying things up if you're scaling up, or down if you're scaling down. So a square grid just helps to keep things simple and just avoid any distortion in your drawing. Something I recommend you do when working from a grid is to number your grid squares both horizontally and vertically. So I'll just add some numbers now to the X and Y axis. This is just going to make things a little easier when I come to start locating different parts of the drawing onto my grid on the drawing paper. I'm now going to bring in my drawing paper, and this is larger than my reference photo. And I want to scale up the drawing to be as large as works on this paper. So I will start by roughly measuring the paper. If I was aiming to double the size of this drawing, my paper would need to be able to fit on a grid of 12 inches wide by 18 inches high, which is double the size of my original grid. But I can see that the paper is not large enough for that, so I'll check to see if I could use a 1.5 times larger. So if my grid squares were 1.5 inches square, I'd need a size of 9 inches wide by 13.5 inches tall, which would fit on this paper. So that is what I'm going to do. This part can be the trickiest bit of the process if you're scaling up or down with your drawing. So use your calculator if it helps. Essentially, you take the height of your drawing paper, divide it by the number of grid squares you want to have, so 9 in our case, and this will give you the maximum grid height. Do the same for the width too, but be aware that you may end up with two completely different figures here for the horizontal and vertical. So what we need to do is either round down to an easier to digest number, so we're using 1.5, or you can take the smaller of the two numbers and use that for your grid square size. This means that we know the grid will definitely fit onto our paper. This is actually a really helpful technique to use if you're designing something large like a mural, but in reverse. So we take those large measurements and scale down to a size that we're happier to design at. Okay, so I'm using grid squares which are 1.5 inches. So my grid is going to be 9 inches wide by 13.5 inches high. I've just measured it and I feel like I've started too close to the edge, so I'm just going to turn my paper over and start again. I'm going to number my grid squares on my drawing paper as I go. This is just so that I can be sure that I've calculated the grid correctly, and I'm going to end up with the same number of grid squares high and wide as my initial grid. I'm going to make sure those corners are a nice 90-degree angle again using my set square. It is really worth spending the time doing that to give you a more accurate grid to start out with. Again, I'm putting markers at 1.5 inch intervals, which is the size of my grid squares, and I'm going to number them as well to make sure I've got the correct number of grid squares. I can just use the reference photo as my set square because I know this has a good 90-degree corner to it. So don't forget, if you don't have a set square, just improvise with what you do have. I can see here I didn't draw the line quite long enough. This is why numbering those grid squares can be really quite helpful. So I'll just add one more marker. Oops, I've just realized that I was using inches for my measurements instead of 1.5. So I'll just rub that line out and just redo it. Okay, so I'm now going to complete my grid and connect all those markers together. This is now going to give me a grid of the same proportions to the one on my reference. And remember that proportions just relate to size relationships between different parts of an object, not the size itself. So I could draw a grid of any size as long as those grid squares are square and that there are 9 of them high by 6 of them wide, then my grid will work. I'm just putting some extra markers down the middle of my grid just because the height of it is a bit longer than my ruler. So my ruler won't stretch all the way across. That's just going to help to make sure that I don't make those grid lines wonky. Okay, so I'm ready to start drawing now. It does not really matter where you begin. I quite like to start somewhere nearish to the left side, just because I'm right-handed, and so this will help me to avoid smudging my drawing. But feel free to begin anywhere. I want to find where the position of the pepper hits the horizontal grid line between grid 4 and 5. So I'm roughly dividing that grid square in half and in half again. So I have quarter markers on that line. And that is going to help me to more accurately locate the position of that line. I'll lightly sketch in the shape from this grid square and then move on to the next one and do exactly the same. I'm tracing around the outline of the shape and transferring the shape into the corresponding grid square. And I'm just pressing fairly lightly with my pencil in case I make a mistake and want to erase something. Where there are any trickier bits to locate, like the very tip of the stalk here in grid square 2, 1, I'm dividing that grid square up into more grid squares by adding dividing lines at the centre horizontally and vertically, which can be really helpful to locate those shapes, and which can be a bit trickier, or any grid squares which have a lot of detail in them. It can just help to make the process feel just a bit less intimidating and overwhelming if you're just working square by square. I find it helps me to keep one finger on the part of the reference that I'm working on, just because as my eyes are kind of flicking between the drawing and the reference, it can just help me to relocate my eye line to the right spot a little quicker, and it just helps it to feel a bit more natural as I'm working around the shape. You can kind of compare this process a little to tracing, or like creating a dot to dot. In a way, the grid is a bit like a map, and we're just locating all the key landmarks to be able to join everything up as a drawing. So for this reason, the drawing can feel a little bit disjointed and sketchy at this stage. So you could just use this as a base sketch, kind of like a map, and then later on we can use sort of larger, more sweeping, confident marks to draw over this base layer, just to help the drawing feel more natural. So I'm now just going to add those slightly more fluid and natural sweeping lines. Now that I know where they should be going, it's a little easier just to use that base layer as a kind of guide and just do a slightly more kind of darker and more confident version of this outline. You can see that I'm just using sort of longer and smoother strokes to do this, just so that it feels a little bit more kind of natural and organic and confident. Okay, so now I have the outline of the pepper drawn in, I'll turn my attention to the detail inside. And the process here is exactly the same as what we've just been doing for the outline of the pepper. So I'm dividing up my grid square here in this center grid just because I feel as though getting that shape right there will really help me to get the rest of this shape kind of more accurate. Of course, with this process, you can use it as much or as little as you like too. It may be that it's just helpful to get the initial outline of the object, but maybe you'd rather freestyle the rest so that it can feel more stylized or more expressive, or you can use it to construct the entire drawing from start to finish. This is a great technique to help you achieve realistic proportions, so I think it's particularly helpful with subjects like portraits or figures, where proportions can be that bit more challenging, or it's more noticeable if the proportions are a tiny bit off. Just dividing up this grid square again here, just because there's quite a lot going in there with the shape changing and all the seeds, so that's just really helping me to locate all those different bits of the object. I'm just going to complete the rest of the details now, and as it's quite an organic shape, I'm paying a little less attention to things being exactly right. So I'm not necessarily drawing every single seed in the right place, just because I think that's unnecessary, but I'm using the grid to help me more or less position things correctly so they look pretty much in the right place, and then that helps the overall drawing just feel like it's got more accurate proportions. Okay, I think I've got enough detail in there now, and I'm pretty happy with the end result. Thanks for watching, and I hope I'll see you in another of my videos soon. Bye for now.